The rain had been falling since before dawn. It came in slow, heavy sheets across the Texas plain, turning the red dust roads into dark ribbons of mud and bending the tall grass flat against the earth. By the time the morning train from the east appeared on the horizon, the sky above Millhaven had settled into the color of old iron, low and pressing, as though the clouds themselves had grown tired of holding their weight. The station was small. A single platform of weathered pine boards, a covered awning that leaked in 3 places, and a hand-painted sign that had faded so much in the sun that half the letters were nearly gone. A few men stood beneath the awning, collars turned up, watching the locomotive push through the gray distance with that particular kind of patience that belonged to people who had learned long ago that the land out here moved on its own schedule, not theirs. The train arrived with the sound of iron and steam, its brakes screaming softly against the wet rails as it slowed alongside the platform. The smell of coal smoke drifted back through the rain. Doors opened. Passengers began stepping down onto the boards, pulling coats tighter, reaching for luggage, calling out to people waiting with umbrellas. And then, near the last car, a young woman appeared at the top of the iron steps. She paused there for just a moment, one hand resting on the rail, looking out at the town spread before her. She was 24 years old, though the weeks of travel had added a certain careful stillness to her face that made her seem older. The stillness of someone who had been bracing for something difficult and had not yet allowed herself to stop bracing. Her dress was a faded blue cotton, washed so many times it had gone soft as paper. Her boots were clean but worn at the heel. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a dark bonnet now spotted with raindrops, and in her right hand she carried a small brown suitcase that held nearly everything she owned in the world. Her name was Nora Ashby. She came down the steps slowly, her shoes touching the wet boards of the platform, and for a moment she simply stood in the open air of this place she had never seen before, this town she had crossed half a country to reach. The sky felt immense above her. The wind pushed rain sideways beneath the awning's edge, and the prairie beyond the station stretched outward in every direction like something that had no interest in walls or ceilings or the small, careful lives people tried to build inside them. She had imagined Texas differently. She was not sure exactly how, only that the reality of it was larger and louder and more indifferent than anything she had pictured in the narrow room she had left behind in Boston 3 weeks ago. In her right hand, tucked between her palm and the handle of the suitcase, was a letter. The envelope had gone soft from being opened and folded so many times during the journey. The paper inside was thin and slightly damp now from the rain, and the ink had smeared at the edges of the page, but the words in the center were still perfectly clear. She had read them so many times she no longer needed to unfold the letter to see them. The last line read, "I will be waiting at the station. Harlan." She had carried those 7 words for 3 weeks, through the changing train cars and the cold nights and the long stretches of flat land where there was nothing to look at but the darkening sky and her own reflection in the window glass. She had repeated them like a quiet promise, something to hold on to when the distance between who she had been and who she was trying to become felt too wide to cross. She had not been a fool about it. She understood the arrangement for what it was, a practical agreement between 2 strangers who had exchanged careful letters and seen each other only in photographs. She had not expected love. She had expected something steadier than love, something with ground beneath it. A home, a reason to stay somewhere, a life that belonged to her in a way that the last several years had not. 3 weeks earlier, she had stood on a different platform in a city she had lived in for 6 years, and she had had nothing. It had happened quickly, the way certain disasters do, not with a great storm, but with a single quiet moment that undoes everything before and after it. The morning she had arrived at the tailor's shop where she had worked as a bookkeeper for 4 years to find the door locked, and Mrs. Calloway standing in front of it with 2 other women, and the ledger open in her hands, the column of missing figures, the signature on the final page. Nora's signature. She had stared at it. She had felt the cold move through her in a slow, particular way, not the cold of the air, but the cold of understanding. Someone had written her name in that ledger. Someone had been very careful about it. The numbers were gone. The explanation was simple. The women standing in front of the door looked at her with an expression she recognized immediately, not doubt, but decision. They had already decided. She had said, "I didn't do this." The words had come out steady, which surprised her. She had looked at Mrs. Calloway and said it again. "I did not do this." And Mrs. Calloway had looked back at her for a long moment, her face not unkind exactly, just resolved. And then she had looked away. There was no one to speak for Nora. There had never been anyone. Her parents had been gone since she was 11. She had no family in the city. The women she worked with were not unkind, but they were not friends in the way that meant anything in a moment like that one. She had stood on the sidewalk with the cold October air moving past her and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was entirely alone in the decision that had just been made about her. She had gone back to her room and sat for a long time without moving. Then she had opened the drawer of the small writing table beside her bed and taken out the most recent letter from a man in Texas she had never met, a man who had written to her through the correspondence office on Wentworth Street 3 months earlier and who had written again every 2 weeks since. His letters were direct and without ornament. He described his ranch, his cattle, the dry heat of the summers, and the way the storms moved in off the plain. He described himself plainly. 38, a widower for many years, looking for a practical woman of good character who understood that frontier life was not easy, and who wanted nonetheless to build something lasting. He had said in his 4th letter that she sounded like a woman who had been carrying things alone for too long. She had read that line and put the letter down and looked at the wall for several minutes. And then she had written back. She had told him the truth, not all of it. She had said she was leaving her position in Boston for reasons she preferred not to discuss by letter, and that if he was still looking for a wife, she was still willing to be one. She had sent the letter on a Wednesday. His answer arrived by Friday, brief and unambiguous. "Come when you're ready. I will be waiting at the station." She had been on the train by Sunday, standing now on the platform at Millhaven with the rain tapping against the brim of her bonnet. Nora lifted her eyes and began looking for him. The photograph she had received was old, creased at the corners, showing a man in his late 30s with dark hair and a direct expression, well-dressed, the kind of man who looked like he expected to be believed when he spoke. She scanned the faces under the awning, the men standing near the wall, the small clusters of people waiting. Then she found him. He was standing near the far end of the platform, slightly apart from the others, exactly as she had imagined in 100 small rehearsals during the journey. He was well dressed even in the rain, his coat fine and dark, his boots polished despite the mud. His hair was combed back, and he held his hat under one arm with the ease of someone accustomed to being looked at. He was exactly what his photograph had promised. Nora let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. She straightened her shoulders. She walked toward him. Each step on the wet boards felt deliberate, the way steps feel when you are aware that you are walking toward a version of your life that does not yet exist. The rain continued its soft percussion against the station roof. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough to see the details the photograph had not shown, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight set of his jaw, the way he was looking at her. He was looking at her with an expression she could not name immediately. Not welcome, not recognition, something else. She said softly, "Harlan." He tilted his head slightly. His eyes moved over her, not quickly, slowly, the way a man examines something he is trying to value. Then he looked away, out toward the train, as if checking whether there might be someone else behind her who had not yet stepped down. She said, "I'm the one you wrote to." He looked back at her. He cleared his throat once. His mouth shifted into something that was almost a smile, but harder, the kind of expression that means amusement at a situation rather than warmth for a person. He said, "I see." And then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough for several people nearby to turn their heads toward them, he said it. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The station was quiet enough, and his voice was clear enough, and the silence that followed them was absolute in the way that certain silences are when everyone within earshot understands exactly what they have just heard. He said that the photograph she had sent had been considerably more flattering than the original. There was a sound from somewhere to her left, a small sound, the kind that people make when they are trying not to make a sound. Nora felt the air change around her. She was aware of the watching faces, the stillness of the men nearby, the particular quality of attention that comes when a crowd decides it is witnessing something worth remembering. She felt the rain against her face. She felt the wet boards beneath her feet. She felt the letter in her hand, the paper soft and damp, the ink running at the edges. She did not look down. She did not step back. She kept her eyes on his face, and she said quietly and without trembling, "You wrote those letters. You invited me here." Harlan Voss looked back at her for a moment. His expression did not change much. He shifted his weight slightly and glanced sideways at the men standing nearby. A brief, social glance, the kind that says, "You see what I am dealing with." He said that letters were one thing, and marriage was another, and he trusted she understood the distinction. He said he had a reputation in this town to consider. Then he placed his hat on his head, turned, and walked away through the rain. Just like that. No further explanation. No apology. He walked to the edge of the platform, stepped down into the mud, and moved off down the street without looking back, his coat dark and neat and perfectly dry beneath his hat, growing smaller until he was just a shape in the gray distance, and then nothing at all. The station returned slowly to its ordinary sounds. Conversations resumed in lower voices. Footsteps moved away. The train whistle called once, distantly, as the locomotive continued its westward journey, leaving behind the smoke and the steam and the particular silence that follows departure. Within a few minutes, the platform was nearly empty. Nora stood exactly where she had been standing. Her suitcase hung at her side. The letter was still in her hand, though she was not aware of holding it anymore. She was looking at the place where Harlan Voss had stood, at the marks his boots had left in the wet wood, already filling softly with rain. She had known, somewhere beneath the careful optimism she had packed alongside everything else in that brown suitcase, that this was possible. She had known it the way you know about certain dangers, not with certainty, only with the awareness that the possibility exists and that you have chosen to proceed anyway, because the alternative is to not proceed at all. She had crossed half a continent on a promise made by a stranger in a letter, because it had been the only door left open to her. And now that door had closed. The wide Texas sky pressed down across the platform. The rain moved sideways in small, cold gusts. Somewhere behind her, the last passengers from the train had gone their separate ways. Into the town, into waiting wagons, into the ordinary continuation of their ordinary lives. The station master had gone inside. The platform was quiet. "I came all this way," she said. The words came out as little more than breath, not directed at anyone, just released, the way pressure releases when you stop holding it. She was not going to cry. She had decided that somewhere around Kansas, in the middle of the second night, that she was not going to cry about whatever happened. She had cried enough in the room in Boston. She had cried until the thing inside her that produced tears seemed to go dry. And then she had sat with a dry feeling for 2 days. And then she had packed her bag and left. But she was also, she realized, standing very still on an empty platform in a town where she knew no one, with exactly $4.30 in her coat pocket and nowhere to sleep. The wind pushed a sheet of rain across the boards at her feet, and then she heard it. Boots. Slow and steady on the wet wood, not hurrying toward her, not the quick step of someone coming to help or to stare, just a deliberate, unhurried sound, the kind made by someone who has already decided to move in a direction and sees no reason to change pace for anyone. She turned. He was standing perhaps 10 feet away, leaning slightly against one of the wooden support posts that held up the station roof, half in shadow. He had clearly been there for some time. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, wearing a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and canvas work trousers darkened at the knee from kneeling in wet ground. His clothes were practical to the point of severity, not poor, but belonging to a man who had never concerned himself with the impression they made. His hands were at his sides, the hands of someone accustomed to work, large and scarred at the knuckles, and entirely still. His face was not easy to read. It was not amused. It was not pitying. It held a particular kind of stillness that she would come to recognize later as its ordinary expression, the face of a man who watched things carefully and spoke only when he had decided it was worth the trouble. He was perhaps 38 years old. He had dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, and eyes the color of the sky before weather, a gray that shifted when the light shifted. There were lines at the corners of those eyes, the lines of years spent squinting across open land, and something else there too, something quieter and harder to name, a kind of knowledge worn into the face the way the weather wears into wood. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Cormac Dean. He had come into Millhaven that morning for fencing wire and grain. He had been standing near the post for the better part of an hour, waiting for the station agent to finish with another order when the train had arrived. He had watched what happened on the platform with the same steady attention he gave to most things. He had watched Harlan Voss walk away, and he had watched the woman standing alone in the rain after, and something in the quality of her stillness had made him stay where he was instead of leaving. He said quietly, "You traveled far." It was not a question. She nodded once. He looked toward the street where Harlan Voss had disappeared. He said without apparent feeling, that was a foolish thing for him to do. She made a small sound, not a laugh. Something shorter and more tired than a laugh. "Maybe he was right about me," she said. She said it honestly, not fishing for disagreement, just testing the idea aloud, the way you test ice before you put your weight on it. He looked at her then, directly, with those weather-colored eyes. He shook his head once. "No," he said, "not from what I saw." A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar. Then he said the thing that she would remember for years afterward, the thing she would find herself returning to on quiet evenings when the ranch had gone still and the stars were coming out over the Texas plain. He said it simply, without calculation, in the same flat, unhurried voice he had used for everything else. He said it as though it were a thing he was noticing rather than a thing he intended, the way you might notice the direction of the wind or the color of the sky and say it aloud because the observation seemed true and silence seemed insufficient. He said, "It feels like you came for me." She looked at him. She was not sure she had heard correctly. He shifted slightly, rubbed briefly at the back of his neck, the first self-conscious gesture she had seen him make. He said he had a ranch about 10 miles north of town. He said it had plenty of empty space. He said she looked like someone who needed somewhere to sleep tonight, and that he had no promises to offer her, only a roof, and no particular reason to be anything other than plain about it. She studied his face for a long moment. She looked for the calculation in it, the angle, the version of the same trick Harlan Voss had run on paper for 3 months. She had learned to look for it. She was good at finding it. She did not find it here. She said, "You don't even know my name." He gave the smallest shrug. "Sometimes," he said, "that's how things start." She picked up her suitcase. She looked out at the gray horizon beyond the station, at the wide land that offered nothing in particular and did not pretend to, and then she looked back at this stranger leaning against his post in the rain with his sleeves rolled up and his plain face and his impossible, unexplained sentence. She said, "My name is Nora Ashby." He said, "Cormac Dean." He walked toward the wagon he had left tied near the station wall. She followed, one step behind, her boots quiet on the wet boards. Neither of them spoke again until the town was behind them. She did not look back at the platform. But as the wagon turned north onto the mud road, in the brief moment before the station roof passed out of her sightline, she caught a shape at the far end of town. A man standing at the edge of the street, coat dark and dry beneath his hat, watching the wagon move away. Harlan Voss. He was not walking. He was not hurrying after them to apologize, or to reconsider, or to call her back. He was standing perfectly still in the gray rain, watching, with a particular quality of attention that belongs not to a man who regrets something, but to a man who is deciding whether a thing that has just happened is useful to him. The wagon wheel hit a rut, and the town disappeared behind a rise in the road. Nora faced forward. The rain had thinned to a mist. The prairie opened around them, wide and colorless, and entirely indifferent to whatever was beginning or ending on its surface. The horses moved steadily through the mud. The wagon creaked. Beside her, Cormac Dean held the reins loosely in his large, scarred hands and looked straight ahead at the road. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the 7 words on its final line. Then she thought about the 7 words he had said instead, standing in the rain on a platform where she had lost everything she had crossed half a country to find. It feels like you came for me. She did not know yet what that meant. She did not know yet what the next weeks would bring, or what the ranch that waited 10 miles north of Millhaven held inside its walls, or what kind of man sat beside her now in the thinning rain, carrying his own weight of history and silence. She did not know about the ledger on the shelf, or the letter she would find in a wooden trunk, or the debt that connected this quiet man to the polished one who had walked away from her at the station. She knew only this. Somewhere back on that platform, something had ended. And somewhere ahead on this road, through the mist and the red mud and the wide Texas silence, something she did not yet have a name for had very quietly begun. The ranch appeared through the mist like something that had always been there, patient and unchanged, waiting for the land around it to catch up. Nora saw it first as shapes. A long roof line rising against the gray sky, the dark outline of a barn, wide and low, its weathered boards the color of old pewter in the rain. A fence line running east along a rise in the ground, and beyond it, the slow movement of cattle drifting through the wet grass. Then, as the wagon rolled closer and the mist thinned, the details resolved themselves one by one. A wooden house set on a small rise, 2 stories, solid and square, built by someone who had cared more about permanence than appearance. A covered porch running the length of the front, a single wooden chair on that porch, facing the open plain. 1 chair. She noticed it without meaning to, the way you notice the absence of a thing before you notice the thing itself. Cormac brought the wagon to a stop beside the barn. He climbed down without ceremony and came around to her side, offering his hand to help her step down. His grip was brief and impersonal, the grip of someone who has been raised to perform a courtesy without making anything of it. She stepped down onto the wet ground, her boots sinking slightly into the mud, and stood looking at the house while he unhitched the horses. A boy appeared from inside the barn. He was perhaps 16, slight and dark-haired, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large that made him look younger than he was. He stopped when he saw Nora, his eyes going wide in the frank, unguarded way of someone who had not expected company and did not yet know how to pretend otherwise. Cormac said, without looking up from the harness, "This is Pete. He works the ranch with me." Pete looked at Nora. He looked at Cormac. He appeared to have several questions, and the good sense not to ask any of them. He said, "Yes, sir," and took the horses' leads from Cormac's hands, and led them toward the barn without another word, though Nora noticed him glance back once over his shoulder as he went. Cormac picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it. He carried it toward the house without asking. Inside, the air was cool and still, holding the particular quiet of a place where only one person had lived for a long time. The kitchen was the first room, large and functional, with an iron stove against one wall and a heavy wooden table in the center, 4 chairs around it. Though the chairs were pushed in at exact equal distances from the table, in the way that suggests no one has pulled them out and pushed them back in irregular rhythms for a very long time. The shelves held plates and cups arranged with a kind of mechanical neatness, useful but not personal. There were no flowers. There was no color anywhere that had not come with the wood or the iron. Clean, careful, empty in some way that cleanliness could not account for. Cormac set her suitcase at the foot of the stairs. He opened a drawer in the kitchen table and took out a key. An ordinary iron key, nothing distinctive about it. He placed it on the table in front of her without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "Spare room at the top of the stairs," he said. "Second door on the left. The lock is solid." He paused for just a moment, and then he said, "I don't have another key." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without emphasis, without apparent awareness that what he had just told her was not a practical detail but something considerably more significant. Then he turned to the stove and began building a fire. Nora stood with the key in her hand. In 4 years of boarding in the city, she had lived in 3 different rooms, each one with a lock that the landlord also held a key to, a fact she had been aware of every single night in a particular low-frequency way, the way you are aware of a loose step on a staircase or a window that does not quite close. She had never said anything about it because there was nothing to say, because that was simply how it was, because she was a woman alone in a city and certain arrangements were simply the terms of that situation. She looked at the key in her palm for a long moment. Then she picked up her suitcase and carried it upstairs. The room was plain and clean. A bed with a white coverlet, a small table with a lamp, a window that faced north toward the open plain. She set her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the key in her hand one more time. Then she got up, crossed to the door, and locked it. She stood in the locked room for a moment, testing the feeling. Then she unlocked it again, not because she needed to, but because she realized, with some surprise, that she did not feel she needed to. She was not sure what to make of that. She came back downstairs to find that Cormac had started a fire in the stove and was sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of coffee, looking at nothing in particular. He glanced up when she came in, then back down at his cup. She stood at the edge of the kitchen for a moment, and then, without asking, she crossed to the shelves and began finding things. He watched her without comment as she moved through his kitchen. She opened the cabinet beside the stove and found flour, lard, a paper sack of dried beans, a tin of salt. She found a pan on the lower shelf and set it on the stove. She worked quietly, without explanation, without performing the work for an audience, simply doing it the way she had always done things when there was something to be done, and no particular reason to wait for permission. After a while, Cormac said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know." She did not stop. He watched her for a moment longer. Then he said, quietly and without any particular intonation, "You're good at that." She almost smiled. "When you grow up with very little," she said, "you learn to make simple things taste better." He did not respond to that, but he did not look away immediately either. They ate together in the growing dark, the rain still moving against the windows in soft, irregular patterns, and the fire making the kitchen warm in the particular way that fires make closed spaces feel temporary and sufficient. They did not talk much. What they said was practical. She asked about the well, and he told her where it was. She asked about the stove's temperament, and he told her it ran hot on the left side. Small information, the kind exchanged between people who are still deciding what category the other person belongs in. She washed the dishes. He went to check on the horses. Pete appeared briefly for his supper and disappeared again with the efficient invisibility of a boy who has learned when adults need the room to themselves. That night, lying in the plain room at the top of the stairs with the sound of rain softening against the roof, Nora looked at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about Boston, about the cold sidewalk and the locked door and Mrs. Calloway's resolved, unkind face. She thought about the letter she had carried across the country, now folded at the bottom of her suitcase. She thought about Harlan Voss walking away through the rain without looking back. Then she thought about the key on the table, the way Cormac had set it down without explanation, as though it were simply obvious that a woman deserved to lock her own door and hold the only key. She fell asleep before she expected to. The days settled into a rhythm the way days do when there is enough work to fill them. Cormac rose before light. She could hear him moving through the kitchen below her room in the pre-dawn dark, the particular quiet sounds of a man long accustomed to beginning his day before the rest of the world was ready to. By the time she came downstairs, the fire was already burning, and he was usually gone, out to the fields or the barn, his coffee cup rinsed and set on the shelf with the same mechanical neatness as everything else in the house. She did not ask what needed to be done. She looked at what had not been done, and she did it. She cleaned the shelves that had gathered dust behind the useful things at the front. She found curtain fabric in a wooden trunk in the back room, old cotton, faded to the color of winter light, and she washed it in the basin and hung it to dry on the porch rail and then cut it and hemmed it with the small sewing kit she had packed in the bottom of her suitcase. She hung the curtains in the kitchen windows one morning before Cormac came back from the fields, smoothing the fabric flat along the rod, stepping back to look. The room looked different, softer, like a room where someone lived rather than a room where someone slept. She found a jar on the shelf, and she filled it with wild grass flowers from the edge of the fence line, the small yellow ones that grew in the mud near the water trough, and she set it on the kitchen table. That evening, Cormac came through the door and stopped. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the curtains, then at the jar of flowers on the table. He stood there for long enough that Nora, who was stirring something on the stove, turned to see why he had gone quiet. She saw him looking and said nothing. After a moment, he said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I wanted to." He looked at the flowers for another moment. He said, "They look nice." Then he hung his coat and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table, and that was all he said about it. But she noticed that he moved his coffee cup slightly to the left so the jar could stay where it was. The first real test came on a Wednesday. Cormac had been out since before dawn repairing a section of fence along the eastern pasture, and Pete was with him. Nora was in the kitchen when she heard the horse. Not the usual sound of hooves on the dry ground. Something irregular, labored, a rhythm with a catch in it. The sound of an animal favoring a leg. She went out to the barn. The horse was a bay mare, one of 3 Cormac kept for working the ranch. She was standing against the far wall of her stall with her head low and her right rear leg held at a slight angle, the hoof barely touching the ground. Nora could see the swelling even from the barn doorway, a hot puffed ring above the fetlock, and the dark stain where something had cut through the skin and left a wound that had been open long enough to need attention. She stood at the stall gate for a moment, looking. The mare's eye rolled toward her, white at the edge, frightened but exhausted past the point of much protest. Nora had grown up in a neighborhood in Boston where a doctor came once a week if the weather was good and twice a month if it was not. The family 2 doors down from her boarding house had kept a horse. She had watched the older woman who lived there tend animals the way other people tended gardens, with patience and knowledge accumulated over years of necessity. She had watched more carefully than the woman knew. She went to the kitchen and came back with what she needed: warm water from the stove, clean cloth torn from an old shirt she found in the rag bin, a tin of salt. She worked slowly, talking to the mare in a low, continuous voice, not because she thought the horse understood the words, but because the voice itself was the point, the steadiness of it, the signal that whatever was happening was not alarming. She cleaned the wound. She packed it lightly and wrapped it with the cloth, firm but not tight, the way she had watched done a dozen times in that narrow street in Boston. The mare shifted and blew air through her nose but did not kick. When it was done, Nora stood back and looked at the leg and felt reasonably certain she had done what could be done. She went back inside and washed her hands and started dinner. When Cormac and Pete came back that evening, and Cormac went to check the horses as he always did, she heard him stop in the barn. A pause longer than the usual. Then his footsteps came back toward the house, unhurried but deliberate. He came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He said, "Who did that?" She said, "I did." He was quiet for a moment. He looked back toward the barn, then at her. He said, "Where did you learn?" She said, "I just paid attention." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, and his expression shifted in some small way she could not precisely name. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to the look of a man recalculating a distance he thought he had already measured. He said, "The rap is right. The tension... Most people get that wrong." She turned back to the stove. She said, "The left side runs hot." He almost said something else. She could feel him at the edge of saying it, but he only went to wash up, and the moment passed and dinner was quiet, as it always was. The next morning, she found a pair of worn leather work gloves on the kitchen table. They were too large for her hands, the fingers thick and calloused shaped, sized for someone considerably broader. She picked them up and turned them over. There was a note beneath them, 3 words in a plain, compressed hand: "Colder next week." She put the gloves on. They were far too big. She wore them anyway. It was on a Saturday, 12 days after she arrived, that she met Eugenia Pratt. Mrs. Pratt came in a wagon from the east, a small upright woman in her 60s with white hair pinned very precisely and the particular manner of someone who has decided that directness is a virtue and that time spent on indirection is time wasted. She brought a pie. Apple, from the smell of it. She handed it to Nora at the door with the air of a woman performing a civic duty, taking the full measure of Nora's face and dress in the same efficient moment. She came inside without being invited, which seemed to be simply how she operated. Cormac was in the far field. Pete was in the barn. Mrs. Pratt sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Nora poured for her, and spoke about the town and the weather and the state of the road between her property and Cormac's, and Nora answered what she asked and listened to the rest and understood that this was an assessment being conducted with the social camouflage of a visit. Finally, Mrs. Pratt set down her cup. She looked at Nora directly. She said, "You came in on the Tuesday train." Nora said that she had. Mrs. Pratt said, "I heard what happened at the station." Nora said nothing. Mrs. Pratt looked at her for a moment, and then something in her expression shifted slightly. A softening so brief, it might have been imagined, but Nora thought it was real. She said, "Harlan Voss is a man who values appearances above most things." She paused. "He has always been that way." She said it without apology or condemnation, only as a fact, in the way that people speak about the permanent qualities of landscape. Then she said something else. She said in a somewhat lower voice, though there was no one else in the room to hear her, that Nora ought to be aware of certain things. That Cormac Dean was a man of more integrity than most in this county, and that she meant that as genuine fact and not as flattery. That the ranch had seen some difficulty these past 2 years, dry summers and poor cattle prices, and a loan taken out against the land after a hard winter, and that the man who held the paper on that loan was not a man she would personally choose to be indebted to. Nora said, "Who holds it?" Mrs. Pratt looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. She said, "Harlan Voss bought the note from the bank 6 months ago." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Nora looked at the table. She looked at the curtains she had hung on the windows, moving slightly in the draft from the stove. She thought about Harlan Voss standing at the far end of the street as the wagon pulled away. Not moving, just watching, with the quality of attention that belongs to a man who is making calculations. Mrs. Pratt set down her cup and stood and straightened her coat. She said, "I don't tell you this to alarm you, only because you seem like a woman who prefers to know what she's dealing with." She said goodbye to Nora at the door and drove her wagon east through the morning light. Nora stood on the porch and watched her go. She stood there for a while after the wagon disappeared. Then she went back inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelf above the stove, where a wooden box sat pushed back behind the tin of salt and the jar of dried herbs. She had noticed it before. She had told herself it was not her place. She looked at it now with a different understanding. She crossed to the shelf. She lifted the box down and set it on the table and opened it. Inside were papers, folded documents and loose pages covered in figures, some in a careful hand she did not recognize, some in what she was beginning to understand was Cormac's compressed and minimal script. She sat down at the table and began to read. She was a bookkeeper. She had been a bookkeeper for 4 years before someone had put her name on a page she had not written. She understood numbers the way some people understand weather, not by calculation but by feel, a sense for the direction things were moving and how fast. She read through the papers slowly, turning each page with the same careful attention she had given to every ledger that had passed through her hands. When she finished, she sat with the papers in front of her for a long time. The ranch was not ruined. That was the first thing she established clearly in her mind, because it was the most important. The cattle operation was sound. The land was productive. Cormac ran the place with an efficiency that showed in every line, but the loan sat against the operation like a stone in a stream, not large enough to stop the flow entirely, but placed precisely enough to redirect it, to slow it, to put constant pressure on the margins until either time or misfortune did the rest. And the rate Harlan Voss had set on the note was not the rate the bank had offered. She had seen this before, not in ranching, but in the workshop accounts she had kept for Mrs. Calloway. She had watched numbers arranged to look inevitable that were not inevitable at all. This was the same shape, only larger. She saw something else, too. A possibility. A way through that would require moving quickly and accepting a smaller immediate return on a portion of the herd. But that would generate enough cash payment to satisfy the most dangerous portion of the debt before Harlan Voss had opportunity to apply pressure. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a solution. She sat with it for a long time. Then she heard boots on the porch steps. The kitchen door opened. Cormac came in and stopped. She had not had time to put the box away. It sat open on the table in front of her, papers spread across the wood, and she was sitting behind it with her hands folded and her eyes on him. He went very still. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. The expression on his face was not anger, but it was not nothing either. It was the expression of a man who has kept a thing private for a long time, and is now looking at the fact of it being private no longer. She said, "I looked." He said, "I can see that." She did not apologize. She said, "I can help." The silence in the kitchen was of a specific and significant kind, the silence of something being decided. She held it. She had learned a long time ago that some silences needed to be held rather than filled, that filling them too quickly was a way of taking the decision away from someone who needed to make it themselves. Cormac stood in the doorway for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she could not fully read. Then he crossed the room and picked up the papers and put them back in the box. He closed the lid. He set the box back on the shelf in exactly the position it had been in before. He said, without turning around, "This is not your concern." She said nothing. He stood with his back to her for a moment longer. Then he said, in a somewhat different voice, quieter, less certain of itself, "That information is not to leave this house." She said, "I understand that." He turned then and looked at her, and she held his look steadily, and she saw in his face the thing she had been trying to place since the station, the thing that sat beneath the reserve and the silence. It was not coldness. It was damage, old damage, carefully managed, the kind that makes a person's expressions smaller and their movements more deliberate, because they have learned at some cost that large expressions and careless movements lead to things being broken. He went to the stove and poured coffee and sat down at the table across from her. Not close, not friendly, but present, across the table. He said, "What did you see?" She told him. All of it. The rate discrepancy, the pressure point, the window of possibility she had identified. She laid it out in the same plain language he had used with her since the station. No softening, no performance. Just what she saw and what she thought it meant. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, looking at the table. Then he said, "You were a bookkeeper?" She said, "Yes." He said, "In Boston?" She said, "Yes." He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment. He said, "And you left?" She said, "I was made to leave. There is a difference." He looked at her. She held the look. Neither of them looked away. He said, "I'll think about what you've said." It was not agreement. It was not dismissal. It was something in between. The response of a man who is honest enough not to pretend he has not heard something that he has, in fact, heard. She nodded. She cleared the cups from the table and washed them in the basin. He went back outside. Pete appeared for supper and disappeared again into the evening. That night, before she went upstairs, she stood for a moment in the kitchen and looked at the box on the shelf. She looked at the curtains in the windows. She looked at the jar of yellow flowers on the table, still holding their shape in the lamplight. She thought about Harlan Voss standing still in the rain, watching the wagon go. She thought about the key she had been given without a copy being kept. She thought about the word that Mrs. Pratt had used, casually, at the end of a sentence, as though she had not understood its weight. Indebted. She went upstairs. She did not lock the door. Outside, the prairie had gone dark and still, the way it went after rain, the grass holding the last of the light long after the sky had let it go. Somewhere out beyond the fence line, the cattle moved slowly through the dark. The single wooden chair on the porch held the night and nothing else. But in the kitchen, on the table, the jar of yellow flowers was still there, and the curtains moved gently in the last heat of the cooling stove, like something breathing. The storm came without much warning. There had been signs, the way there are always signs on the open plain if you know how to read them. The particular stillness that settled over the grass in the hour before noon. The smell in the air, electric and green. The smell of water still miles away but moving fast. The cattle drifting without being driven toward the lower pasture, following some older instinct that had nothing to do with fences or the directions of men. Cormac had looked at the sky at midday and said 2 words to Pete: "Get ready." By mid-afternoon, the wind had come up hard from the northwest, bending the tall grass flat and sending the loose boards of the fence gate banging against the post. The first thunder rolled across the plain like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Then the rain came, not gradually, but all at once, the way Texas rain comes in September, as though the sky had been holding it back by force and had simply stopped trying. Nora was in the kitchen when it hit the house. She heard the sound of it on the roof, like 1,000 hands pressing down at once, and she went to the window and looked out and saw nothing but gray, solid gray from the ground to the sky, the barn a dark blur 30 feet away, the fence line already invisible. She did not stand at the window long. She pulled on her coat and the overlarge work gloves and went outside. The wind hit her like something with intention. It pushed the rain sideways and found every gap in her clothing, and she bent her head against it and moved toward the barn, following the fence rail with one hand because the visibility was nearly nothing and the ground had already gone soft and uncertain beneath her feet. She heard Cormac before she saw him, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm, calling to Pete somewhere in the dark beyond the barn. She followed the sound. The cattle were wrong. That was the first thing she understood when she got close enough to see. 3 of them had pushed through a weakened section of the east fence and were moving away from the shelter of the low pasture toward the open plain, heading in the direction that frightened animals always head, which is away, without destination or plan. If they got far enough in this visibility, they would not come back on their own, and finding them after the storm in unfamiliar ground would cost days. She did not think about it carefully. She simply moved. She went left, circling wide around the spooked animals the way she had watched Cormac work the herd on ordinary afternoons, not pushing from behind but getting ahead, positioning herself as a boundary rather than a threat. The rain was full in her face, and she could barely see, and the ground pulled at her boots with every step. But she kept moving, kept her arms wide, kept herself between the cattle and the open plain. Cormac appeared on her right, materializing out of the gray like something the storm had produced. He saw what she was doing, and without a word he adjusted, moving to close the gap between them, the 2 of them forming a wall of presence that the cattle felt more than saw. Pete came from behind, quieter than she expected for a boy his age, moving with surprising instinct. They worked for 20 minutes in the rain and the noise and the dark, and then the cattle were back through the gap and Cormac was pulling the broken fence section closed with wire and bare hands, while Nora held the post and Pete held the rail, and the storm screamed around all 3 of them as though personally offended by their persistence. When it was done, they stood for a moment in the rain, all 3 of them breathing hard. Then Cormac looked at Nora across the fixed fence. The rain was running down his face, and his shirt was soaked through entirely, and there was mud to his knee. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had of looking at things he was revising his understanding of. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She pushed the wet hair back from her face and picked up the wire tool from the ground and handed it to him, and they walked back to the barn. The storm held through the evening and into the night. The road into Millhaven was a river by dark, impassable until morning at the earliest. Pete ate his supper and fell asleep in the barn loft rather than fight his way home in the weather, which seemed to suit everyone. The house settled into the particular intimacy of a place sealed against a storm. The outside world dissolved into sound and water. The inside world contracted to the small radius of the lamplight. Nora dried her hair by the fire and did not speak for a while. Cormac sat at the table with a cup of coffee he was not drinking, looking at the surface of it. The storm moved against the windows in irregular pulses. The curtains she had hung shifted with the draft. It was not uncomfortable. The silence. That was the thing she kept noticing. It had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without her marking the moment of change. It had become something else, something that did not require filling, that held its own weight without becoming heavy. She said, without planning to, "Was it always this quiet here?" "Before." He looked up from his coffee. He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean when you lived here before. When there was someone else." He was still for a moment. He said, "There wasn't. Not in this house." She looked at him. He said, "I have lived alone on this ranch for 11 years. Before that, I lived here with my father until he died, and before that, with my father and my sister." She said, "Anna." He looked at her. Something moved across his face and was gone. He said, "You found the handkerchief." She said, "In the trunk. I put it back. I'm sorry." He shook his head once, a small motion that meant the apology was unnecessary rather than unwelcome. He looked back at his coffee. The fire shifted and settled and sent a brief pulse of orange light across the kitchen walls. She waited. He said, "Her name was Anna Dean. She was 6 years younger than me. She came to live here on the ranch when our father's health failed, to help manage the house. She was 23 years old." He stopped. He picked up the coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. He said, "In the spring of 1877, she developed a fever. It moved fast, the way those fevers do. Within a week, she could not stand. I knew she needed a doctor. The nearest one was in Millhaven, 12 miles east. It had rained for 10 days without stopping, and the creek crossing on the east road was flooded. I told myself it would clear by morning. It did not clear by morning. I told myself it would clear by the following morning." He stopped again. The storm pressed against the house with a sound like breathing. He said, "She died on the 4th day, in the room at the top of the stairs, the same room you are sleeping in now." Nora was very still. He said, "The creek cleared the day after she died. I could have made the crossing if I had tried 2 days earlier. I chose to wait because I thought I was being careful. I thought I was protecting her from the risk of the crossing." He said it without drama, without the particular vocal quality that signals a performance of grief. He said it the way you state a fact that has been examined so many times it has worn smooth, the edges gone, the original sharpness replaced by something duller and more permanent. She understood then what she had been looking at for 2 weeks. The single chair on the porch. The mechanical neatness of a man who has arranged his life to leave no spaces where something soft could collect. The way he stood slightly apart from everything, as though proximity itself was a risk he had learned to manage. He was not cold. He was a man who had made himself careful. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and she took out the handkerchief She had not planned to have it with her. She had picked it up from the trunk days ago, intending to return it to its exact position, and had instead put it in her pocket without quite knowing why, had carried it through the days since then without examining the impulse too closely. She set it on the table between them, the white cotton, the careful embroidery, a D in pale blue thread, small and even. Cormac looked at it for a long time. Then he reached out and slid it gently back across the table toward her, not taking it away from the space between them, not claiming it, just returning it to her side of the table, a gesture so quiet it barely registered as a gesture at all. She left her hand near it. Neither of them spoke. The storm moved over the house, and the fire breathed in the stove. And somewhere in the barn, Pete slept through all of it without knowing what was happening in the kitchen below the lamplight. She said, "In Boston, there was a woman who owned the workshop where I kept the books. She was not cruel. She was practical. When the money went missing from the ledger and my signature was on the page, she looked at me, and she had already decided. There was no argument I could make because the decision had nothing to do with evidence. It had to do with the fact that I was the one who could be lost without consequence. She said I had worked there for 4 years. I had never taken a thing that did not belong to me. I had come in early and stayed late and done the work of 2 people because I was grateful to have the position. And when it mattered, none of that was worth one person willing to stand up and say, 'I believe her.'" Cormac was listening. She could feel him listening the way you feel weather, not by seeing it, but by the change in the air. She said, "That is what it is like to have no one. Not loneliness. Loneliness is something you feel in the evenings. What I mean is something structural, a fact about your position in the world. You understand that there is no floor beneath you, that whatever you are standing on, you are standing on it alone, and if it gives way, there is nothing and no one to catch you." She stopped. The fire shifted. She had not said that to anyone before. She was not sure she had even said it to herself in those words. Cormac said after a moment, "How long have you known that?" She said, "Since I was 11, when my parents died." He said nothing to that. He did not say he was sorry, which she appreciated, because she was tired of the word sorry applied to facts that could not be changed. He simply sat with what she had said, let it occupy its full space in the room, did not hurry past it or smooth it into something easier. After a while, he said, "I have been the floor for this ranch for 11 years, since my father died. There was a time when I thought that was enough, that if the land was sound and the animals were cared for and the work was done, that was a sufficient life." She waited. He said, "I am not certain anymore that it is." She looked at him across the table. He was looking at the handkerchief or at the table beneath it, or at something further away than either. She said, "Cormac." He looked up. It was the first time she had used his name without it being preceded by something else, a question or a practical statement. Just his name, by itself, in the lamplight. He held her eyes for a long moment and said nothing, and the storm moved over the house. In the morning the sky was clean. The rain had stopped before dawn and left the world rinsed and particular, every fence post standing out sharply against the pale sky, the grass flattened and silver with water, the mud paths through the ranch gleaming in the early light. Pete emerged from the barn with straw in his hair and an expression of profound contentment that suggested he had slept better than any of them. Nora came downstairs to find Cormac already at the table. In front of him, open and weighted flat with his coffee cup at one corner, was the wooden box. The papers were spread across the table. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Tell me what you saw. All of it. From the beginning." She sat down across from him. She pulled the nearest page toward her and began. They worked through it for 2 hours, the coffee going cold between them, Pete appearing and disappearing with the discreet usefulness of someone who has decided to be needed without being noticed. Nora laid out the problem and the possibility the way she had seen it, step by step, the same plain language she would have used over a ledger in Mrs. Calloway's workshop. Cormac listened, asked precise questions, pushed back in 2 places where he had knowledge of the cattle market she did not have, and she adjusted her calculation accordingly. At the end of it, he sat with the revised numbers in front of him. He said, "If we move on the buyer in Harding County within the week, we can make the first payment before Voss has reason to apply pressure." She said, "Yes." He said, "And if the buyer agrees to the terms?" She said, "He will agree. The price I have suggested is below market rate for that grade of animal. He would be a fool not to." Cormac looked at her. He said, "You seem certain." She said, "I am certain about the numbers. I was always certain about the numbers." That was never the question. He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood. He said, "I'll ride to Harding County on Friday." She nodded. She began gathering the papers back into the box. He said, "Nora." She looked up. He said, "Why are you doing this?" She had been expecting the question. She had her answer ready, and then she did not use it. Because when she looked at his face, she understood that the answer she had prepared was a careful answer, a defended answer, and he had just spent 2 weeks earning something less defended than that. She said, "Because this is the first place I have been where the door locks from the inside, and I would like it to stay standing." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the papers in her hands. Then he got up and poured himself more coffee, which she had noticed was what he did when he had received something he needed time to hold before he could respond to it. She put the box back on the shelf. That afternoon, he showed her how to check the tension on a fence wire without cutting herself on the barbs. He stood close enough to correct her grip when she held the tool wrong. 2 brief adjustments, his hand over hers for just the time required, and then gone again. She learned the correct grip in 3 attempts. He said, "You'll know next time." She said, "Yes." On the way back to the house, he said, without preamble, "You should know something about Harlan Voss." She waited. He said, "He came to me 2 years ago wanting to buy this land. Not rent. Not a business arrangement. Buy. He had a price, and he presented it the way men like him present things, as though the decision has already been made, and the conversation is a formality. I told him no. He came back 3 months later with a higher price. I told him no again. The 3rd time he came, he did not bring a price. He brought a banker from Millhaven who explained to me very carefully the terms of the loan I had taken out the previous winter. He said I did not understand at the time that Voss had already purchased the note from that banker. I understood it 6 weeks later. She said, "When did you find out?" He said, "Eugenia Pratt told me. She has a way of knowing things before the people involved know them themselves." Nora almost smiled. She said, "She brought apple pie." He said, "She always brings apple pie. It does not mean she is not watching everything." They walked back toward the house in the afternoon light, the wet grass bright around the path, the sky enormous and clean above the plain. Pete was visible at the far end of the barn, doing something with a bucket that appeared to involve considerably more effort than a bucket should require. Nora said, "He came to the station that morning to watch." Cormac said, "I know." She said, "He knew who I was. He knew I was coming." Cormac said, "Millhaven is not a large town." She said, "He wanted to see what I looked like, whether I was worth keeping his plan for." Cormac stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The plain stretched west ahead of them, the sun falling toward the horizon in long gold bands across the wet grass. She said, "And then he decided I was not." Cormac turned and looked at her fully, which he did not do often, not as restraint, but as a kind of economy, the way a man who speaks rarely does not waste the words he does use. When he looked at her like this, directly, with those gray eyes that shifted color in different light, it was always with the quality of genuine attention. Nothing performed about it, nothing spared. He said, "He was wrong about that." She held his look. The wind moved through the grass around them with a sound like water. Then from the far end of the barn, Pete shouted something involving the bucket that required Cormac's immediate attention, and the moment dissolved, and they walked the rest of the way to the house in the ordinary late afternoon, and nothing more was said. But that evening on the porch, when the sun had gone and left only the afterlight, copper and fading, stretched across the western plain, they sat together on the steps rather than in the single chair, close enough that the air between them was warm. Pete had gone to his family for the night. The ranch was very quiet. Cormac said, without looking at her, "You have been here almost 3 weeks." She said, "I know." He said, "You could have gone to town by now. Found other arrangements." She said, "I could have." He said, "You didn't." She said, "No." The afterlight held for a moment longer, and then it was gone, and the stars began coming out above the plain, one by one, in the enormous Texas dark. She did not move. He did not move. His shoulder was touching hers. It had happened gradually enough that neither of them had noted the exact moment of it, the way two things settle together when the surface beneath them shifts slightly. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the warmth of the fire, as a simple physical fact that was also something else, something that did not have an obvious name, but that felt, in its quiet way, like the thing she had been trying to describe to herself since the morning she had come downstairs and found the key on the table. Like standing on something solid, like a floor that would hold. Neither of them moved apart. Inside, in the kitchen, the lamp burned low on the table. The curtains moved in the cooling air. The handkerchief sat folded on the shelf beside the wooden box, in the place where Nora had put it after the storm, and the jar of yellow flowers caught the last of the lamplight and held it. Harlan Voss came on a Thursday. Nora was hanging washing on the line behind the house when she heard the hoofbeats on the front road, a single horse moving at the unhurried pace of someone who has not come in urgency but in certainty, the pace of a man who believes he is expected even when he has not been invited. She did not go around to the front immediately. She finished pinning the shirt she was holding to the line, smoothing the shoulders flat with both hands, and then she walked around the side of the house. He was already dismounted, standing in the yard with his reins looped over the post, looking at the house with the assessing expression of a man calculating the distance between what something is and what it could be made into. He was dressed as he always dressed, fine coat, polished boots, hat at the precise angle that suggested he had checked it before leaving. He looked like a man who had decided, a long time ago, that appearance was a form of argument, and who had been winning that argument ever since. He saw her come around the corner, and he smiled. It was a good smile. That was the difficult thing about Harlan Voss, she had decided. None of it was crude. He was not a man who sneered or threatened or made his meanings obvious. He was a man who understood that the most effective pressure is the kind that looks like something else entirely. He said, "Miss Ashby, you look well." She said, "Mr. Voss, Cormac is in the east pasture." He said, "I know. I saw him ride out this morning." The admission sat in the air between them. He had known Cormac was not here. He had timed his arrival accordingly. He let her understand this without commenting on it, which was worse than if he had tried to hide it. She said, "Then I'll tell him you stopped by." He said, "I was hoping to speak with you, actually." He gestured toward the porch. "If you have a moment." She did not move toward the porch. She stayed where she was, in the yard, with the washing line behind her and the open ground to her left, and she looked at him steadily and waited. He appeared to find this mildly amusing. He came a few steps closer, not threatening, just closing the conversational distance, the way a man does when he wants a response to feel more intimate than formal. He said, "I owe you an apology." "For what happened at the station?" She said nothing. He said, "I behaved badly. I was surprised, and I handled my surprise poorly, and I said things in a public place that I should not have said." He paused. "I have thought about it a great deal since then." She said, "Have you?" He said, "I have. And I have come to believe that I made an error in judgment, not only about how I handled the situation, about my initial assessment." She looked at him. She kept her face quiet, the way she kept it quiet when she was reading a ledger that did not add up and did not want the person watching her to know yet that she had found the discrepancy. He said, "You are clearly not a woman without resource. What you have done here, with this house, with Dean's operation," he gestured vaguely toward the house, the kitchen window, the curtains she had made. "I have heard things. From people in town." She said, "People talk a great deal in small towns." He said, "They do. And what they are saying about you is not unflattering." He looked at her with a directness that was calibrated, she thought, to feel like honesty. He said, "I made an offer to you in Boston through a correspondence agency. That offer was rescinded badly and in public, and that was wrong. I am here to tell you that the offer stands." She said, "The offer." He said, "Marriage, my ranch, a position of genuine standing in this community, everything I originally promised in those letters." She said, "I see." He said, "You came a long way for a life, Miss Ashby. I am offering you the life you came for." The yard was quiet. The washing moved on the line behind her. Somewhere in the distance a hawk made its thin, circling cry over the plain. She said, "And Cormac's ranch." He did not blink. He said, "What about it?" She said, "You hold the note on this land. You know that I know that. So I am asking plainly, if I accept your offer, what happens to the note on Cormac Dean's ranch?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled again, slightly differently this time, with a quality of genuine appreciation in it. The look of a man who has been surprised to find the game more interesting than he expected. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it up so she could see it without coming close enough to take it. He said, "I tear this up, today, in front of you, his ranch, free and clear." He let her look at the document for a moment. Then he folded it again and returned it to his coat with the same ease with which he had produced it. He said, "Think about it. I will come back on Saturday for your answer." He picked up his reins, stepped up into the saddle, and looked down at her from the height of the horse with an expression that was almost, she thought, respectful. He said, "You are not what I expected, Miss Ashby. I mean that as a compliment." He turned the horse and rode back down the front road at the same unhurried pace at which he had arrived. She stood in the yard and watched him go. She stood there for a long time after he had disappeared. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wooden box on the shelf. She did not take it down. She did not need to. She knew the numbers by heart now, had carried them in her head since the morning she and Cormac had spread the papers across the table and worked through them together. She knew exactly how much was needed and how quickly and what the margins were. She knew that Cormac had ridden to Harding County 2 days earlier and come back with a handshake agreement from the buyer there and a payment date set for the following week. She knew it was close. She knew it was possible. She also knew that possible and certain were not the same thing. She sat at the table with her hands folded and looked at the curtains moving in the kitchen window and thought about a ranch, free and clear. Today, in front of you. She took the letter from her coat pocket. Not Harlan's first letter, the one she had carried on the train. That letter was still in her suitcase upstairs, in the bottom beneath her folded clothes, and she had not looked at it in days. This was a different paper, the one she had been using to work the numbers, covered on both sides in her own small figures. She turned it over to the blank side and picked up the pencil from the shelf and began writing, not numbers this time, but words. And then she crossed them out, and then she wrote different words. And then she put the pencil down and looked at what she had written and crossed that out too. There was no version of this that was clean. She heard Pete come into the barn from outside, the familiar sound of his boots and the particular way he moved, light and uneven, still growing into his own height. She thought about Pete, who was 16 and had no family in the county that she had been able to determine, and who slept in the barn loft with the ease of someone who had learned not to require more than he was given. She thought about what happened to Pete if the ranch failed. She thought about Anna Dean, 23 years old, dying in the room upstairs in 1877 while the creek crossing sat impassable between her and the help she needed. She thought about what that had made Cormac into, the particular shape of a man built by that kind of loss, the careful distances, the mechanical neatness, the single chair. She thought about the key on the table. She put the paper in her pocket and went upstairs and began doing something she had not done since the first night. She took the brown suitcase from under the bed and set it on the coverlet and opened it. She was looking at it, at the folded clothes and the small tin of sewing supplies and the worn copy of a book she had carried since Boston, when she heard the front door open downstairs. She heard him cross the kitchen. She heard the particular silence of a man who has walked into a room and found it changed in some way he cannot immediately account for. Then she heard his boots on the stairs. He stopped in the open doorway of her room. He looked at her. He looked at the suitcase, open on the bed. Something moved across his face and went still again, quickly, the way a flame moves when air hits it from an unexpected direction. He said, "Voss was here." It was not a question. She did not know how he knew, whether Pete had seen the horse on the road, or whether he had simply looked at her face and read it the way he read the weather, by small signs that other people missed. She said, "Yes." He came into the room 2 steps and stopped. He said, "What did he want?" She told him. All of it. The apology, the offer, the folded document. The the price he had named, and the thing he had offered in exchange. She told it plainly, without softening it or inflecting it in any direction, just the facts of it in the order they had happened, the way she had always reported numbers, because the numbers were the numbers, and pretending otherwise did not change them. When she finished, Cormac was standing very still. He said, "He offered to tear up the note." She said, "Yes." He said, "In exchange for you going back to town with him." She said, "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. The window was open and the afternoon air moved through it, carrying the smell of dry grass and the distant, clean smell of the creek, still high from the storm. He said, "And you are packing your bag?" She said, "I am looking at my bag." He said, "There is a difference." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back down the stairs. She heard him in the kitchen. She heard the sound of a chair moving, the particular sound of someone sitting down heavily rather than by choice. She closed the suitcase and pushed it back under the bed and went downstairs. He was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the wood in front of him, looking at the wall. He did not look up when she came in. She sat down across from him and waited. He said, finally, "The Harding County buyer confirmed in writing. I have it in my coat. The payment date is Tuesday. It covers the primary note." She said, "I know." He said, "So we do not need his offer." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her then. He said, "Then why is the suitcase out?" She said, "Because I was sitting with the question honestly, instead of pretending it was not there." He looked at her for a long time. His face was doing the thing it did when he was holding more than he intended to show, the small compressions around the mouth, the particular set of the jaw, the way his eyes went very still rather than moving the way eyes usually move. He said quietly, "It is not your debt." She said, "No." He said, "This ranch is not your obligation." She said, "No." He said, "You came here with nothing. You owe this place nothing. You owe me nothing." She said, "I know all of that, Cormac." He said, "Then go." The word came out low and compressed, not unkind, worse than unkind, careful. He said, "If he is offering you the life you came west for, then go. Take it. You have earned a life that does not depend on the margins of a cattle operation and a loan that should have been paid 2 years ago." She looked at him. She said, "Is that what you want?" He said nothing. She said, "Because that is a different question from what I should do or what I am owed. I am asking you what you want." He stood up from the table abruptly, the chair scraping back, and he crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the yard, the washing still on the line, the barn, the fence line running east toward the open plain. His shoulders were rigid. She could see from across the room the effort it was costing him, that rigidity, the effort of a man holding himself at a particular posture because he does not trust what will happen if he stops. He said, his voice very low, "I cannot ask you to stay." She said, "You have not asked me for anything since the day you put that key on the table." He said nothing. She said, "That is the problem, Cormac. You have made yourself into a man who does not ask for things, because asking means you might lose them. Because you have already lost the things you loved on this land, and you have decided that the only protection is to stop wanting." The washing moved on the line in the yard outside. The hawk cried again somewhere far above, distant and impersonal. He said, without turning around, "That is not something I can argue with." She said, "I know. I am not asking you to argue with it. I am just telling you that I see it." He turned then. His face was not what she expected. It was not closed. It was the opposite of closed. It was the face of a man who has been holding something at a precise distance for a very long time and whose arms are simply, finally, tired. He said, "I cannot lose this ranch." He said it not with pride, but with something older and more complicated. He said, "My father built this place. Anna died in this house. Every fence line on this land I have repaired with my own hands. If I lose it, I lose the last place in the world where any of that happened." He stopped then, and something that had been braced in his chest gave way without warning. His jaw moved once, tightly, and his eyes grew bright, and he turned his face briefly toward the window. His hand on the window frame trembled for just a moment. The knuckles pressed hard into the wood, and then he stilled it by force. It was not a collapse. It was a man who had been standing in a particular kind of pain for years, pressing his full weight against a wall that had finally, in this kitchen, in front of this woman, shown him it would not hold forever. Nora did not look away. She held the silence exactly as it needed to be held. After a moment, he breathed, long and slow, and his hand came down from the window frame. The kitchen had gone entirely still around them. She looked at his hands on the table, flat and motionless, the knuckles pale from the pressure he was putting against the wood. She had seen those hands manage a frightened horse in a storm, pull wire through a fence post in the freezing dark, hold a coffee cup with the kind of careful grip that belongs to men who are afraid of small acts of comfort, because comfort costs something they cannot afford to lose. Now they were just two hands pressed against a kitchen table by a man trying to hold himself together from the outside in. She had not expected this. She had expected the reserve, the measured refusal, the quiet determination to send her away for her own good, wrapped in the language of practicality and presented as a gift. She had prepared herself for that. She knew what it looked like. She had been given versions of it her entire life, by employers who let her go with regret, by landladies who apologized while locking her out, by a city that simply moved around her absence as if she had never been there at all. What she had not expected was the trembling jaw, the knuckles against the window frame, the sound his breathing made when it tried to hold itself steady and could not, quite. It was, she understood, the most honest thing he had ever shown anyone, not because it was dramatic, because it was involuntary. Because a man who had spent 11 years making himself smaller and quieter and more controlled than any ordinary life required had simply, in this moment, run out of the particular kind of strength it takes to feel nothing. She did not move toward him. She did not reach for him. She understood that to move too quickly would be to take something from him, to turn what he was experiencing into a scene rather than a truth. She simply stayed where she was, across the table, and held the room steady around him the way you hold a lamp steady in wind, not by shielding it, but by keeping your own hands still. After a while, the trembling in his jaw stopped. The breath that had been working too hard found its ordinary depth. He turned back from the window and he looked at her across the kitchen with eyes that were very clear and very tired and entirely undefended. He said, "And I cannot ask you to be part of a fight that is mine. That has been mine since before you stepped off that train." She said, "You did not ask me. I chose." He looked at her. She said, "There is a difference, Cormac. You taught me that. On the first night, with the key on the table, you gave me a choice. I am making one now." He was still for a long time. Then something in him came down, not dramatically, not with the noise of collapse, but quietly, the way a wall comes down when the thing that was pressing against it from the outside finally stops pressing, and the wall simply realizes it no longer needs to hold. His shoulders dropped. He breathed out a long, slow breath, the kind of breath that has been held for longer than a single afternoon. He said, his voice rougher than usual, "If you stay, it is not because of the debt." She said, "No." He said, "And it is not because you have no other choice." She said, "I have a choice. I am making it." He looked at her across the kitchen, across the table where the papers had been spread and put away, across the space where the jar of flour still stood in the window with the curtains she had made moving around it in the afternoon air. He looked at her with those gray, weather-colored eyes, and she held the look without looking away, and the kitchen was very quiet. He said, "I cannot promise you it will work." She said, "Nothing is a promise, Cormac. That is not how things work. You know that as well as I do." He said, "I cannot give you what Voss is offering." She said, "What he is offering is a transaction." She looked at him steadily. "I have been a transaction before. I know what that feels like." The afternoon light was moving across the kitchen floor in long gold bands, the way it did at this hour, reaching in through the western window and laying itself across the boards with a temporary, unhurried warmth. He said, very quietly, "Why are you doing this?" She said, "Because the first morning I came down those stairs and found the fire already built and the coffee already made and you already gone to work, I understood something." He waited. She said, "You did not build the fire for me to see. You built it because it was cold, and fires need building, and the house needed to be warm. You did not do it to be seen doing it. You just did it because it needed doing." She said, "I have been waiting my whole life to be somewhere where things are done because they need doing and not because someone is watching." He was very still. She said, "That is why." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and he stopped in front of her, close, and he looked at her face for a long moment. And then he reached out and took one of her hands in both of his, the way you hold something you have been afraid to hold in case holding it makes it real enough to lose. His hands were rough and warm, and she could feel every callus, every year of work in them. He said, "I need you to be certain." She said, "I am not certain of anything." She looked up at him, "But I am decided. There is a difference." He held her hand, and the afternoon moved through the kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Then from outside, distant but approaching, came the sound of Pete's voice calling something from the barn, something about the horses, something that required attention, and the world resumed its ordinary motion around them, and Cormac released her hand and went to the door. And she stood in the kitchen with the warmth of his hands still on hers, and looked at the curtains in the window, and the flowers in the jar, and the key hanging on the nail beside the door where she had put it weeks ago, without thinking, without knowing it meant anything. She thought about Saturday, about Harlan Voss returning for his answer. She went to the shelf and took down the wooden box. She sat at the table and opened it and took out the paper with the numbers. She turned it over and picked up the pencil and began to write. Not crossed out this time. Clear and certain and moving forward. Friday passed quietly. Cormac rode to Millhaven in the morning to confirm the payment arrangements with the buyer's representative, A brief and practical errand that should have taken 2 hours and took 3. And when he came back, he said nothing about what had delayed him, only that everything was in order for Tuesday. Nora did not ask. She had learned that Cormac's silences were not evasions. They were simply the space he needed between a thing happening and a thing being spoken, and that the speaking would come when he was ready for it. She spent the day finishing what she had started the night before. The letter she wrote was short. 4 sentences. She addressed it to the buyer in Harding County, confirming the terms Cormac had agreed to, and adding one clarification that she had worked out in the numbers the previous evening, a slight adjustment to the payment structure that would move the first installment 2 days earlier than originally planned, enough to preempt any procedural maneuver Harlan Voss might attempt if he discovered the sale before it was completed. She signed it with her own name below Cormac's, not as an afterthought, but as a fact, the way you sign a document when you have standing in the matter it describes. She gave the letter to Pete in the morning and asked him to ride to the postal office in Millhaven before noon. Pete looked at the letter, then at her, then back at the letter. He was 16 and not always quick to understand the full weight of what adults asked him to do, but he was perceptive in the specific way of someone who has spent considerable time watching people navigate difficulties from a slight distance, and he understood enough. He put the letter inside his coat and saddled his horse without being asked twice. She watched him ride down the front road and then went back to the kitchen. She did not tell Cormac about the letter until that evening, after supper, when Pete had gone to his family and the house had gone quiet. She told him plainly what she had written and why, and then she put the copy of the letter she had kept on the table in front of him and waited. He read it. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at it for a moment, without speaking. She watched his face move through something she could not fully name, not surprise exactly, something more complicated than surprise. The expression of a man recalculating not a number, but a belief he had held for a long time about what he was entitled to expect from the world. He said, "You did this without telling me." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because you would have argued about whether it was your decision to make, and we did not have time for that argument." He looked at her. She looked back. After a moment, something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but in the vicinity of it, a quality she had begun to recognize, the rarest of his expressions, the one that appeared when she had said something he had not anticipated and found he could not disagree with. He said, "You are not easy to argue with." She said, "No, I have been told that." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He said, "When Voss comes tomorrow." She said, "I will speak to him." He said, "We will speak to him." She looked at him. He looked back, and the word was still in the air between them, small and exact and entirely deliberate. "We." She said, "All right." Saturday morning came in clear and cold. The sky, the pale, flat blue of early October. The grass silvered with frost that would be gone by mid-morning. But that made the ranch look, in the early light, like something preserved under glass. Nora built the fire before Cormac came downstairs, and when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she handed him his coffee without comment, and he took it without comment. And they stood together at the kitchen window, watching the frost on the fence posts catch the first light. They did not have to wait long. Harlan Voss arrived at 9, as punctual as she had expected him to be. He rode up the front road at his customary pace, unhurried and certain, and dismounted at the post with the ease of a man who is accustomed to arriving at places and being received. He straightened his coat. He looked at the house. Then he looked at Cormac standing on the porch, and his expression adjusted itself in a small, practiced way, recalibrating without revealing that it was doing so. He said, "Dean." He nodded once. Cormac nodded once in return. Then Voss looked at Nora, standing beside Cormac on the porch, and he smiled the smile she had come to understand was his most dangerous one, the one that looked like warmth and functioned as something else entirely. He said, "Miss Ashby, I trust you've had time to consider." She said, "I have," he said, and she said, "I have a different proposal for you, Mr. Voss." He raised an eyebrow slightly. He was still smiling. He said, "I see." He looked briefly at Cormac, then back at her. He said, "I'm listening." She said, "The note you hold on this ranch will be paid in full on Tuesday. Principal and interest, every figure, paid through a third-party buyer in Harding County, whose agreement was confirmed in writing 3 days ago." She paused. "I have a copy of that confirmation if you would like to see it." The smile did not disappear. It changed. It became something held in place by intention rather than feeling. He said, "That is a considerable arrangement to have made in a short time." She said, "I had good numbers and a clear picture of what needed doing. Those two things together tend to move quickly." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his look without moving. Beside her, she was aware of Cormac standing very still, the particular stillness of a man who has decided not to speak because the person beside him is handling the thing that needs handling, and who trusts that enough to let it be handled. Voss said, "And if I decline to accept early payment?" She said, "The terms of the original note do not exclude early payment. I have read the document carefully. You accepted it as written when you purchased it from the bank." Another pause. The frost was going off the fence posts in the strengthening morning sun, the light shifting as it went. He said, "You read the note?" She said, "I read everything." He looked at her for a long time. The calculation in his face was visible now, not hidden. The look of a man running through his options and finding them fewer than he had arrived expecting. He was not a man accustomed to that experience, she thought. He was a man accustomed to arriving at the end of a calculation first and letting other people catch up at whatever pace suited him. He said, "You understand I came here with a genuine offer." She said, "I understand that. And I understand what it would have cost." He said, "It would have cost you nothing you weren't already willing to give up." She said quietly, "That is where you are wrong." The yard was still. Somewhere behind the barn, a horse moved in its stall, a soft, rhythmic sound. The morning was very clear. Voss looked at her, then at Cormac, then back at her, and she thought she saw it. The thing she had glimpsed once before, in that brief moment on the road when his horse had carried him away from the station, the thing that sat beneath the calculation and the fine coat and the polished certainty. Something smaller and more human than any of the rest of it. She did not feel sorry for him, but she looked at it honestly, the way she tried to look at most things, without adding weight to it that it did not carry on its own. He reached into his coat and produced the folded document. He held it for a moment, looking at it. Then he set it on the porch railing between them. He said, "Tuesday, then. Full settlement." She said, "Yes." He picked up his reins. He looked at her one final time, and she thought the expression on his face was the most honest one she had seen him wear since the station. Something stripped of its customary performance, something that might, in a different life or a different man, have been called regret. He said, "You are not what I expected, Miss Ashby." He said it the same way he had said it before, but it meant something different now. She said, "No, I expect I'm not." He put his hat on and rode back down the front road, and she watched him go, and this time she felt nothing in particular about his departure. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. Something more like the feeling at the end of a long calculation when the final figures have been set down and the page can be closed. Cormac picked up the document from the railing. He looked at it for a moment, at the figures and the signatures, all the formal language of debt and obligation. Then he looked at Nora. He said after a moment, "That was yours." She looked at him. He said, "What you just did, that was yours, not mine." He looked at the document again. "I have been trying to solve this problem for 2 years. You solved it in 3 weeks." She said, "I had good information." He said, "You had the same information I had. You did something different with it." She said, "I did not have 11 years of carrying it alone. That changes how you see numbers." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the document down on the porch railing and he turned to face her fully, the way he did when he had decided a thing was worth the full weight of his attention. The morning light was on his face, the October light, clear and without sentiment, and in it she could see him plainly. All of it. The years of work in the lines of his face, the careful distances he had built and maintained, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been afloor for a long time and has not once allowed himself to sit down. He said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been alone on this ranch for 11 years, and I have not once in those 11 years believed that was going to change. Not because I decided it, just because it seemed to be the shape of things." She waited. He said, "And then you stepped off a train in the rain, and some fool walked away from you on a platform. And I said something I could not explain, and brought you home in a wagon, and you hung curtains in my windows, and put flowers on my table, and told me the truth about my own ledgers, and sat up with me in a storm. And I am standing here on my own porch in the morning, telling you what you already know, which is that the shape of things has changed." She said, "It has." He said, "I am not easy to live with. I am quiet, and I am set in my habits, and I do not say things as often as I probably should." She said, "I know." He said, "And this place is not what Voss was offering. It is a working ranch with hard winters and dry summers and more problems than solutions on any given day." She said, "I know that too." He said, "So?" She said, "So what?" He said, "So I am asking you, not assuming, not arranging, asking." He looked at her with those gray eyes that shifted with the light, that had been shifting with the light for weeks now and showing her something different each time. He said, "Will you stay?" She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the ranch behind him, the weathered barn and the frost-silvered fence lines and the wide plain beyond, running west under the pale October sky to wherever the sky finally met the earth. She looked at the single chair on the porch that had been the first thing she had noticed, the absence in it, the loneliness of a single chair facing all that open space. She said, "I will need a second chair on this porch." Something moved across his face, something she had not seen before, something unguarded and complete, not a smile exactly, though it was near enough. More like a man who has been standing in a doorway for a very long time and has just taken a step through it. He said, "I expect that can be arranged." She said, "Then yes, Cormac, I will stay." He reached out and took her hand in both of his again, the way he had the afternoon before, and this time he did not let go quickly. He held it in his rough, careful hands and looked at her, and she looked back, and the morning light moved over the ranch, and the frost finished melting off the fence posts, and somewhere behind them, inside the kitchen, the fire was still warm. Tuesday came and went in the clear, unremarkable way of days on which important things are settled without ceremony. Cormac rode to meet the buyer from Harding County at the land office in Millhaven, and came back in the late afternoon with the transaction completed, the note paid in full, and a quietness about him that was different from his usual quietness, lighter somehow, as though something he had been carrying in his chest at a particular angle had shifted and found a better position. He came through the kitchen door and put a folded receipt on the table, and sat down, and Nora poured him coffee, and sat across from him, and they looked at the receipt for a moment in silence. Pete came in from the barn, saw the receipt, looked at Nora, looked at Cormac. He said, "Is it done then?" Cormac said, "It's done." Pete sat down at the table with them, and Nora got up and cut 3 pieces from the apple cake she had made that morning, and put them on plates and set them on the table without ceremony. And that was all the celebration there was, and it was exactly sufficient. That evening, in the last light, Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched the plane go through its colors the way it did at this hour. The gold and the copper and the final deep rose before the dark came. She thought about Boston, about the locked door and the cold sidewalk and the signature on a page she had not written. She thought about the train journey, the flat, dark land going past the window and her own reflection looking back at her, uncertain and determined in equal measure. She thought about the station at Millhaven in the rain, about the moment the letter had become worthless in her hand and the platform had felt like the edge of something with nothing below. She remembered standing there with $4.30 in her pocket and a suitcase that held nearly everything she owned, and how the size of the sky had felt like an accusation. She thought about how far she had come since then, not in miles, in something harder to measure. The distance between a woman who cannot speak for herself because there is no one to hear her, and a woman whose name appears on documents that matter, who stands on a porch and holds her ground, who signs letters not as an afterthought, but as a fact. She thought about signatures, about how much a signature can mean, and how much damage can be done by putting the wrong name on the wrong page, and how the same mark that had destroyed her life in Boston was now, in a different hand, on a different document, the instrument of something being made whole. She thought about Mrs. Calloway's face on that Boston sidewalk, the resolution in it, the way a decision had been visible in her expression before Nora had said a single word, the conclusion already drawn, the verdict already returned. Because it is easier to decide than to listen, and the cost of being wrong about someone who has no power to make you pay for it is nothing. She did not feel anger about it anymore. She was not sure when the anger had gone, only that it had, somewhere between the Kansas plains and the Texas mist, somewhere between the station platform and the kitchen table, somewhere in the weeks of ordinary work in this house that had slowly become hers in the way that only honest labor makes a place yours. What had replaced the anger was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something more like distance, the clear, unsentimental distance of a woman who has moved far enough away from a wound that she can see its actual size, which is smaller than it felt from inside it. She put the receipt in the wooden box, beside the other papers, in the place where the problems had been and where the solutions now lived. Then she stood at the window for a while longer and let the plane do what it always did at this hour, which was to absorb the last of the light and give nothing back except the dark and the stars, and the enormous silence that lay over everything, like something that had been there since before anyone arrived and would be there long after everyone was gone. It was not, she thought, an unfriendly silence. It was simply indifferent, the way the land was indifferent, the way the sky was indifferent, the way everything out here was indifferent to the small particular dramas of the people who moved across its surface. And there was something, she had discovered, that was nearly like comfort in that. The plane did not care about Mrs. Calloway's ledger. It did not care about Harlan Voss's calculations. It did not care about the correspondence office on Wentworth Street, or the narrow room in Boston, or the cold October morning that had set everything in motion. It cared about rain and grass and the movement of cattle and the turning of seasons. It cared in its indifferent way about the work that kept it from going to ruin. It was a place that rewarded the simple disciplines, showing up, doing the work, staying through the hard parts, building what needs building and repairing what breaks. She had been doing that her whole life. She had simply, until now, been doing it for people who did not see it. She took the letter from her coat pocket. She had been carrying it for weeks without quite deciding what to do with it, the way you carry a thing whose time has not yet come. The paper was soft and worn at the folds, the ink smeared at the edges. She looked at the final line one more time. I will be waiting at the station. Harlan. She thought about waiting, about all the things she had waited for and all the things that had not come, and the particular discipline of a life built around learning to do without the things that did not come. She opened the door of the stove. The fire was banked low for the evening, the coals orange and steady. She held the letter for a moment, not hesitating, only finishing the thought. Then she placed it in the stove and closed the door and stood with her hand on the iron handle for a moment while the paper took the heat. She did not watch it go. She simply let it go, which is a different thing. She turned back to the kitchen. The curtains she had made moved in the cooling air of the evening. The jar on the table held the last of the autumn flowers, smaller now, the yellow ones gone, replaced with the pale dried grasses that would hold through winter. The handkerchief sat folded on the shelf where she had placed it, beside the wooden box, in the spot that had become its place in this house. Not hidden, not put away, kept, like something that belonged here. She heard Cormac on the porch. She heard the sound of something being set down, wood on wood, the specific sound of a chair being placed. Then another. 2 sounds, one after the other, and then his footsteps stopping. She went to the door. He was standing on the porch looking at the 2 chairs he had set side by side, facing west, facing the last of the light on the plain. He had found the second chair somewhere, the barn perhaps, or the back room where things accumulated over years of a life, and he had brought it out and placed it beside the first one with the same plain attention he gave to everything. No flourish, no performance, simply a thing that needed doing. Done. He looked at her when she came to the door. She came out onto the porch and sat down in the new chair. He sat down in the old one. The light was nearly gone, just the last pale line of it along the western horizon, and above it the first stars were beginning, one by one, in the enormous Texas dark. Neither of them spoke. The plain was very quiet. The grass moved in the small evening wind. Somewhere far out in the dark, the cattle moved through the pasture in their slow, continuous drift, and the sound of it came back faintly, the sound of large animals at ease in their own ground. Pete's lantern was visible in the barn, a small, steady light in the dark. Nora looked out at the plain and felt, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with choice, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had been promised this, not because it was what she had planned, but because she had walked through the only doors that were open to her, one after another, and this was where they had led, and she had decided, clearly and without reservation, to trust the place she had arrived. Cormac's hand found hers in the dark between the chairs, not reaching, just moving naturally, the way two things move together when the space between them has finally become smaller than the things themselves. His hand was warm and rough and entirely certain, and she turned her hand in his and held it. They sat together while the last light left the sky. Inside, on the kitchen shelf, the handkerchief sat folded in its place. The fire held its warmth in the cooling house. The curtains had gone still. And on the table, in its jar, the dried autumn grass caught the last of the lamplight and held it quietly. The way this land held everything, without ceremony, without promise, simply and completely, and for as long as it lasted, which, on this particular ranch, on this particular plain, under this particular sky, felt like it might be a very long time indeed.